The freighter Wraith drifted above the red storms of Varkos as alarms stitched the silence. Kael Orion steadied his breath, and the deck replied with a tired groan. The narrator traced the dread that pooled behind his eyes. Elara Chen said, "Signal is prewar cipher." Kael said, "That war is ash." The ship answered with a shudder that felt like memory. A ghost channel bloomed across the canopy and wrote a lattice of coordinates. Rix Arden said, "It's a lure or a lifeline." The narrator felt the old wound wake as the code repeated a forgotten name. Kael said, "Open the line." The universe leaned closer and held its breath. The voice that answered was a ruin stitched from whispers and code. The narrator marked how it spoke Kael's unit name like a funeral bell. Kael said, "Identify yourself." The reply named coordinates burned into his past. Elara Chen said, "Source is inside the demilitarized belt." Rix Arden said, "No one transmits from there unless they want ghosts." The voice begged them to witness proof that the war was designed to loop. The ship's lights dimmed as the path unfurled across the void. Kael said, "Plot it." The narrator felt the first hinge of fate turn. They cut into the belt through a drift of satellite husks that turned like dead snow. The narrator traced the hush that comes before a wound reopens. Elara Chen said, "Radiation pockets ahead." Kael said, "We thread the gaps." Rix Arden said, "Contact on R6, no transponder." The unknown shadow mirrored every move like a bad memory. Kael said, "Hold course." The hull sang as dust kissed it with bright sparks. The narrator watched resolve harden where fear had lived. The shadow kept pace and waited. The coordinates ended at a scarred relay spire older than any treaty. The narrator measured how the past waited like a locked door. Kael said, "Power it without waking the net." Elara Chen said, "Localize jump capacitors only." Rix Arden said, "We are not alone." A second shadow separated from the first, patient and hungry. Kael said, "Dock fast." The umbilical latched with a tired cough, and the spire sighed awake. The narrator felt the story shift its weight. The lock began to turn. Inside the spire, dust hung like ash in a chapel after fire. The narrator watched Kael read the walls, etched with the names of ships that never returned. Elara Chen said, "Manual interface only." Kael said, "Record everything." Rix Arden said, "I have a feeling we are being recorded." A dormant array blinked and spilled a feed of battles that looped without end. The voice returned and begged them to break the wheel. Kael said, "Show us how." The room listened as the dead began to speak. The narrator watched quiet settle over the control sanctum as the looped battles dimmed to embers. Kael Orion traced a ship name with a gloved finger, and the dust rose like breath. Kael said, "I signed their orders and sent them into smoke." Elara Chen said, "You brought some of them home when no one else would." Rix Arden said, "Home is a word we keep repairing with tape." The narrator felt the room lean toward a choice not yet spoken. Kael said, "If the war was built to repeat, then my orders were cogs." Elara said, "Then break the machine that used you." Rick said, "And try not to get us welded into it." The console ticked like a cooling engine, and the old names kept listening. The narrator marked how grief became a compass, not a chain. The mess bay hummed with a thin heater, and a tin cup crackled in a reclaimer. The narrator followed the small sounds that make a ship a home. Rix Arden said, "I fly better when I am terrified." Elara Chen said, "That only means you are honest." Kael Orion said, "I froze when the cipher said our unit name." Rix said, "You moved anyway, that is the whole story." The narrator watched hunger fade behind grief as bread steamed in recycled heat. Elara said, "Guilt is a tide, not a verdict." Kael said, "Then we sail it until it turns." Rix clinked his cup and tried on a smile that almost fit. The ship listened and did not argue. In the cockpit, the narrator watched Kael compose a message no one had asked for. Kael Orion said to the families of Patrol 9, Your sons and daughters were brave because they were kind first. Elara Chen said, You do not owe the past an apology to speak to it. Kael said, I owe them the truth I never knew to send. Rix Arden said, Say we will cut the loop that ate them. Kael said, We will try until there is nothing left of us to try with. The recorder light burned like a small star and waited. The narrator felt resolve take on weight, the kind that does not drown. A private channel flared like a needle of glass and cut through the noise. The narrator introduced a voice that walked with caution. Lyra Venn said, I can prove who wrote the loop, but I will not meet you twice. Kael Orion said, Name a place. Lyra said, Palinode Station, Blackout Ring. Bring only those you trust. Elara Chen said, That is a clinic with an airlock problem. Rix Arden said, And a gambling problem. Kael said, We go careful and leave faster than we arrive. The narrator heard the old machine stir as if it disliked being named. And they prepped in the cargo bay, where crates wore old dust like metals. The narrator watched fear take a number and stand in line. Kael Orion said, We carry only what we can abandon. Elara Chen said, Then we carry each other first. Rix Arden said, I packed luck and a spare fuse. Kael said, If Lyra is bait, we chew through the hook. The bay door light cycled, and the harnesses clicked like a vow. The narrator measured how leadership formed not from rank, but from the gravity of care. Kael said, We move and we come back with a map or a scar. The ship lowered its voice to a hum, and opened its hands to the dark. Palinode Station floated in blackout like a scar that refused to heal. And the narrator described the hush that swallows ships with debts. Kael Orion said, Dock silent and keep eyes open. Elara Chen said, If the airlock's groan, we leave. Rix Arden said, They always groan here. The ring turned with patchwork lights that blinked like guilty stars. A hooded figure waited by a broken sign that promised repairs and delivered none. Lyra Venn said, You came alone enough. The narrator noted her voice sounded like a door on careful hinges. Kael said, You said proof. Lyra said, I said once. Boots scraped, and the crowd pretended not to listen. The station breathed in cycles of sour wind. Kael said, Show me who wrote the loop. Lyra said, Not who. What? In a maintenance chapel that smelled of ozone, the narrator watched Lyra open a case lined with old faith and new treason. Lyra Venn said, The loop is a machine of debt and fear. She set a shod that pulsed like a vein. Kael Orion said, Source. Lyra said, Strategic Continuity, Directorate, 3 levels below law. Elara Chen said, The dead were fuel. Rix Arden said, Someone is buying the same victory twice. The door clicked as if a listener breathed. Lyra said, You break it by starving it. Kael said, Show the feed. The shard spilled a lattice of contracts and staged conflicts. The narrator felt the room tilt toward a fight no treaty could hold. A muffled step became a warning too late. The ambush arrived as a tax, and the narrator counted the price in sparks. Station enforcers spilled from service grills with visors down. Kael Orion said, Non-lethal if we can. Elara Chen said, If they agree. Rix Arden said, They never agree. Lyra Venn killed the lights, and the shard folded into shadow. Stun bolts shredded the air like hail. Kael drove them into a corridor where gravity stumbled, and bodies drifted against prayer flags. Elara said, Left pressure is cleaner. Rix said, Right has fewer guns. Kael said, Left and move. The narrator tracked their breath in clouds as the station coughed alarm code. A visor cracked, and behind it, fear looked young. They barricaded a cargo catwalk that rattled like loose teeth, and the narrator introduced the voice that smiled without lips. Admiral Rix Vale said, Kael Orion, You keep finding my errands. His words bled from every speaker. Kael said, You sell peace at interest. Vale said, I maintain continuity. Elara Chen said, Continuity of grief. Rix Arden said, "And invoices." Lyra Venn said, "Cut the feed or cut the catwalk." The station hummed as drones rose like wasps. Vale said, "Return the shard, and I forgive your curiosity." Kael said, "Forgive your own." The narrator felt the catwalk tremble as the swarm learned their names. The drones came in tears, and the narrator timed the swarm by heartbeats. Kael Orion said, "Rix, blind them." Rix Arden said, "On your blink." Elara Chen said, "Shield hot, in 3. Lyra Venn said, "Drop now." The gemmer screamed, and the bay lights died. The shield bloomed and turned bolts to rain. Kael guided fire like a tired prayer, and carved a hole in the noise. Vale said, "Continuity resumes." Kael said, "Not tonight." They ran the catwalk to a maintenance chute that smelled of burnt belts. The narrator noticed a slim disc magnetized to Kael's rig, and no one else did. The disc blinked once, like a seed. The narrator followed the wraith as it tore free of Palinod's gravity aches, and fell into quiet like a held breath. Kael Orion said, "We burn cold and vanish." Elara Chen said, "Your rig is sparking near the chest." Lyra Venn said, "Drones marked us. Expect a tail." Rix Arden said, "I shook them with junk traffic." The shard pulsed faintly in Lyra's palm like a memory trying to live. Kael said, "Find us a dead lane." Elara said, "There is a maintenance corridor through the scrap halo." Lyra said, "Vale owns the halo." Rix said, "Then we borrow it." The narrator felt the crew move in a rhythm that forgave nothing, and still held. Somewhere behind the bulkhead, a tiny red light kept time with a hidden plan. They drifted dark among dead hulls that turned like slow whales, and the narrator mapped the hush between pings. Elara Chen said, "No emissions within a click." Lyra Venn said, "That is either mercy or a net." Kael Orion said, "Hold station and listen." Rix Arden said, "I have chatter on a private lattice." The shard warmed, and contracts flickered like moths. Lyra said, "It wants to speak to the system that feeds it." Kael said, "Starve it with silence." Elara said, "Your rig light is still blinking." Kael said, "Then cut the wire." The tool bit, a spark snapped, and the hull answered with a faint echo that did not belong to them. The narrator counted 1, counted 2, and heard a third heartbeat join. The third heartbeat became torches on the horizon, and the narrator gave them fangs. Vale's hunters bled in from the dark with silencers bright as knives. Kael Orion said, "Brace to burn." Elara Chen said, "Shield in pulses only." Rix Arden said, "I can ghost our signature for 5 seconds." Lyra Venn said, "5 is enough if aim is honest." The wraith rolled as bolts scraped the paint into sparks. Kael said, "Now." Rix counted down in a whisper that shook. The ghost fired, the ship vanished, and a hunter overshot like a thrown stone. The narrator felt hope kick, then stall, as a lock required them from inside their own walls. Elara said, "Tracker was not on the wire." Kael said, "Then where?" They cut power and fell into a rusted barge corpse, and the narrator watched confession arrive like weather. Rix Arden said, "Vale holds my debts from Palinode." Elara Chen said, "Say it quick." Rix said, "I told him where we would drift if we got pinned." Kael Orion said, "You picked our grave." Rix said, "I picked a chance to live long enough to fix it." Lyra Venn said, "Betrayal is a lock. Choose which door it opens." Kael said, "You will lead them to us now, and you will lead them wrong." The hunters fanned out like searchlights on water. The narrator marked the fracture with a quiet line that would not heal fast. Rix climbed to the barge spine, and the narrator followed his breath as he called the wolves. Rix Arden said, "Target in the aft hold, minimal cover." Vale answered with a smile the crew could hear. Kael Orion said, "On my mark, we move opposite." Elara Chen said, "I will paint false heat." Lyra Venn said, "I will plant the shard to sing another tune." The hunters surged into the empty hold and found a decoy that burned like a small sun. Kael led the others through a seam in the barge skin and out into dark lanes. The narrator listened as Vale realized the taste of smoke. Rix dropped back to them with empty hands and eyes that did not forgive himself. The fracture remained, but so did the ship. The Wraith broke into a drift near a fractured moon that wore scars like mirrors, and the narrator carried the weight of silence before truth. Lyra Venn said, "This shard is not just evidence, it is a key." Kael Orion said, "Keys fit locks, and locks guard something." Elara Chen said, "If Vale built the loop, then what does this unlock?" Lyra said, "The archive where the wars are written before they are fought." Rix Arden said, "You mean staged scripts, not battles." Kael said, "If the archive breathes, we cut off its air." The shard pulsed brighter, threads of code stretching across the hull. The narrator marked how discovery tastes like betrayal, disguised as light. Inside the Wraith's briefing bay, the narrator described maps blooming like veins across steel walls. Lyra Venn said, "The archive lies beneath Echelon Spire, cloaked by false treaties." Kael Orion said, "Every fleet drilled under that banner." Elara Chen said, "And every death signed twice." Rix Arden said, "So the loop is an industry, not a mistake." Lyra said, "Industry fed by commanders who fear stillness more than loss." Kael said, "Then Vale is not alone." The lattice pulsed with red marks, each a war that had not yet begun. The narrator measured the room's silence as heavier than fire. The narrator followed Kael into the quiet of the maintenance bay, where shadows turned screws into teeth. Kael Orion said, "I sent them to die for nothing." Elara Chen said, "You sent them because you believed. That is not nothing." Kael said, "Belief is the weapon Vale sharpened." Elara said, "Then make it yours, not his." The silence thickened until Kael's reflection in the viewport looked like a stranger. He whispered, "I will lead because I cannot stop it from breaking me if I do not." The narrator felt resolve root itself in grief, and for the first time, it did not bend. The shard opened a sealed channel, and the narrator carried a voice that should have been dust. Commander Solon, once Kael's superior, said, "Kael Orion, the war was written so you could not win." Kael said, "You died at Narth." Solon said, "I was archived, not buried." Elara Chen said, "They store people as well as battles." Lyra Venn said, "Continuity requires actors." Rix Arden said, "Actors who never stop dying." Kael said, "Show me the spire." Solon's voice faltered like static, then whispered, "Destroy it before it writes again." The narrator marked how ghosts become allies when the living fail. The narrator followed the crew to the armory as decisions became steel. Kael Orion said, "We strike the spire even if it takes us with it." Elara Chen said, "Then we make the loss count different this time." Rix Arden said, "Vale will be waiting with a bill in hand." Lyra Venn said, "Vale fears exposure more than defeat." Kael said, "Then we will show his ledger to the stars." The shard pulsed like a heart ready to burst. Harnesses clicked, rifles loaded, and for the first time the Wraith felt not like a home, but a blade. The narrator knew the climax waited just beyond silence. The narrator followed the Wraith as it slid beneath Echelon Spire, where the void bent like glass. Kael Orion said, "We cut the archive out at the root." Elara Chen said, "Breaches in the lattice cycle every 90 seconds." Rix Arden said, "I can thread the gaps if the ship forgives me." Lyra Venn said, "Vale will speak through every wall." Admiral Seric Vale said, "Continuity salutes initiative." The spire unfurled antennae like thorns, and the hull hummed with old dread. Kael said, "Take us to the blind side and hold." The narrator heard the kind of silence that tastes like metal and prayer. Elara said, "Vitals steady." Kael said, "Then we begin." The archive below whispered names that had not died yet. Missiles woke like teeth, and the narrator counted the seconds between doubts. Kael Orion said, "Break left on my mark." Rix Arden said, 3, 2, ghost. The wraith vanished, reappeared, and shouldered past a curtain of fire. Elara Chen said, "Shields in pulses, or they cook us." Lyra Venn said, "The spire roots fire by prediction, not sight." Vale said, "Every move you make, I have already purchased." Kael said, "Buy this." Rix tore a spiral through decoys that bled heat like false suns. The missiles chased lies and died in bright surrender. The narrator felt hope as a narrow bridge that swayed but held. Kael said, "Docking struts ready?" Elara said, "We have 90 seconds of blind." They slipped into a service maw, and the narrator smelled hot metal in memory. Kael Orion said, "We cut power at junction beta." Elara Chen said, "Archive core sits beneath coolant veins." Rix Arden said, "I will keep the clamps lying about our weight." Lyra Venn said, "This is where the loop writes the next dead." Vale said, "Careful, or you will erase only yourselves." The corridor widened into an atrium of silent servers like winter trees. Kael said, "Plant the charges on the scheduler heart." Elara said, "Timer on manual so we can show the world first." The narrator traced their footfalls like signatures on ice. Lyra said, "Record begins now." The shard opened an artery of secrets. The narrator introduced the heart of the machine where voices overlapped like tides. Admiral Seric Vale said, "Step away, and your names return to life." Kael Orion said, "Life sold is another death." Elara Chen said, "Transmit the ledger." Lyra Venn said, "Uploading to every relay that hates him." Rix Arden said, "Clamps failing if we linger." The archive pushed back with counterfeit truths that glittered like coins. Kael said, "Speak, Solon." Commander Solon said, "Right node, second column, cut there." Elara sliced a cable, and the screens bled into confession. Vale said, "Continuity adapts." Kael said, "Then adapt to daylight." The narrator felt the room brighten with the oldest weapon, a public gaze that refused to blink. Alarms reached a pitch that bent thought, and the narrator gripped the moment with both hands. Kael Orion said, "Detonate on my mark after the upload." Elara Chen said, "We still need a way out." Rix Arden said, "I found a coolant sluice that hates living things." Lyra Venn said, "We will bribe it with speed." Vale said, "You cannot kill an idea that pays dividends." Kael said, "We can bankrupt it." The ledger burst across the network like daylight over rot. Elara said, "Upload complete." Kael said, "Mark." Charges thumped and the scheduler heart cracked open with a long sigh. The narrator watched the loop stutter like a dying reel. Rix said, "Sluice now." Lyra said, "Run." The wraith tore free, carrying proof and scars. The narrator watched the wraith drift beyond Echelon's ruin, while the galaxy learned to breathe without a script. Kael Orion said, "We showed them the ledger." Elara Chen said, "Now they decide if truth can heal." Rix Arden said, "Or merely bruise slower." Lyra Venn said, "The loop stutters, but habit is a cunning engineer." Emergency bands crackled with indictments and denials that sounded like twins. Kael said, "We do not crown ourselves saviors." Elara said, "We triage what we can reach." Rix said, "First reach each other." The narrator noted how silence inside the ship felt warmer than before, as if the hull had learned a better song to hum in the dark. A coalition tribunal blinked to life on shared bands, and the narrator counted the tremor in powerful voices. Admiral Seric Vale said, "Continuity is misread." Lyra Venn said, "Continuity is theft in uniform." Kael Orion said, "You price grief," and sent the bill to children. Elara Chen said, "The archive confesses with its own tongue." Rix Arden said, "Play the excerpt where he calls death a dividend." The feed rolled, and the room of delegates forgot to blink. Warrants went live like stars turning on. Vale said, "I will not be judged by amateurs." Kael said, "Then be judged by daylight." The narrator heard a world choose to look and keep looking. When the bands quieted, a private channel carried a voice that remembered storms. Commander Solon said, "Kael, you aimed true." Kael Orion said, "You gave us the last inch." Elara Chen said, "Can the archive release you now?" Solon said, "I am already spent, but the names you saved are not." Rix Arden said, "We will speak them until they answer back with futures." Lyra Venn said, "Rest old tide." Static crept into Solon's words like snow. He said, "Lead kinder than we were led." The narrator felt a farewell pass through the hull like a bell tone. Kael said, "Aye, sir." The channel folded into honest quiet and stayed. In the cargo bay, the narrator watched repairs become ritual and apology become planned. Rix Arden said, "I will pay what I owe by steering where it hurts." Kael Orion said, "Then take helm of every hard turn." Elara Chen said, "Redemption is maintenance, not ceremony." Lyra Venn said, "I have names of cells who kept receipts." Kael said, "We share the proof in small fires where cold has lived too long." Rix said, "And we do not sell a sequel." The ship creaked as panels settled into new honesty. The narrator noticed fear step aside for craft, the older courage that keeps bolts tight and promises tighter. The narrator closed on a quiet vector where the stars sounded like paper turning. Kael Orion said, "We are not finished." Elara Chen said, "We are not broken either." Rix Arden said, "Call it intermission, not peace." Lyra Venn said, "Signals whisper from beyond the belt with a rhythm I do not know." Kael said, "Then we learn its steps before anyone sells them." The wraith angled toward a thin seam of dark that looked almost like a door. Kael said, "For Patrol 9. Elara said, "For those who never got a last word." Rix said, "For the next ones, if we do it right." The narrator left them mid-breath, where courage feels like a hand opening.